Hello guys, how's it going? My name is Dal, and the seasonal content of patch 10.2 is finally here, which means we get to experience a brand new rating tier and earn some of the newest Season 3 PvP rewards and experience an entirely new set of Mythic Plus dungeons. In fact, we've gotten a chance to experience a lot of the newer seasonal dungeons during our time testing them over on the PTR. Patch 10.2 in particular offers us the brand new mega dungeon of Dawn of the Infinite, though split up into two parts, paired together with two dungeons from Legion, two fantastic instances from Battle for Azeroth, one from Warlords of Draenor, and another one from Cataclysm. And for today's video, I wanted to put together a Mythic Plus dungeon guide for Season 3, to make sure that you are walking into this season better prepared to dive into some of the more difficult Mythic Plus content. But right before we go over this set of seasonal dungeons, most of you guys watching these type of guide videos are still not subscribed. However, the more of you remind, the more of you do. So let's keep it going. Subscribe to the channel and ring the bell if you're watching these videos anyway. Especially if you want to get more regular content regarding Dragonflight 10.2 or any of the future updates going forward. Let's start this guide video off with something more familiar by going over the part 1 and part 2 of the Dawn of the Infinite mega dungeon. Part 1 will start off with the boss of Chronocar, where throughout the encounter, players will have to manage the ability of Sandstomp, which will spawn a sand pool under every party member. You don't necessarily have to keep these closely stacked together, but just make sure you don't have random patches of sand pools all throughout the boss arena. Once Chronocar reaches 100 energy, they'll cast Aeon Shatter at 2 random members, where the boss will leap towards a player's location, which you'll want to dodge. Every single time the boss lands, Aeon fragments shoot out in every direction, which you will want to avoid, and one player will need to soak an Aeon residue, otherwise you take heavy group-wide damage. Besides these, tanks and healers will have to manage Chrono Shear, which will deal heavy damage to the tank, making him more vulnerable for a short amount of time. The tank will have to use defensives to mitigate the damage taken, while the healer will need to overcome the sheared lifespan debuff. Next, we have the Manifested Timeways boss. The boss arena will have 4 pizza slices rotating throughout the encounter. Try to spend majority of this encounter inside of the darker pizza slices for decaying time debuff, which reduces damage taken for your group. Throughout this encounter, the boss will cast Fragments of Time, which are projectile orbs that will shoot out away from the boss. Inside of the decaying time pizza slices, these fragments will be slower, while in accelerating time they'll shoot out much faster. Another mechanic your healer is going to have to manage is Chrono Faded, which is a debuff that will be applied to 2 players. When Chrono Faded is dispelled or expires, a player shoots out a halo. Inside of accelerated time, this halo deals very little damage to your party, so try to position into the accelerated time before a dispel or the buff is expired. Next boss is the Blight of Galakron, which comes in 3 phases. In the first phase, all you have to do is avoid any toxic projectiles. You also have to manage the debuff of Corrosion, which can be passed between players. If Corrosion expires on a player, it'll mind control that target, but passing Corrosion to another player does reset its timer. In phase 1, you'll want to pass Corrosion to the tank immediately so that the boss can use Blight Reclamation in order to remove the debuff. In phase 2, the boss takes on a form of a Proto-Dragon. All mechanics of phase 1 carry over into phase 2. But now the boss will cast Necrotic Winds, which should be avoided. In phase 2, the boss takes a lot longer to consume the Corrosion debuff. What you'll want to do is pass the debuff to the tank, then back to another player, then back to the tank, and try to hold on to the buff for as long as possible before the boss casts Blight Reclamation on the tank. Then we have phase 3, where the boss will split into 2 Proto-Dragons, the Frosty one and the Fire one. The Fire Dragon cannot be controlled by the tank or be taunted, but the Frost one can be, so you want to put the 2 dragons next to each other. All of the mechanics of phase 1 also apply for this phase, but you'll need to balance the Corrosion buff for much longer before the Blight Reclamation ability goes off. The Frosty Proto-Dragon will cast Necrofrost on a player, which needs to be broken out with damage so they can move. The Fire Proto-Dragon will cast Incinerating Blight Breath, which you'll want to make sure to avoid as best as possible. Next, we have a Ritterkron, the Stone Skilled, and this fight is incredibly scripted. The first mechanic your group will have to deal with is Extinction Blast. All a player has to do with Extinction Blast is walk next to Chromie in order to greatly reduce the damage taken. Afterwards, the boss will cast Stonecracker Barrage. There will be 2 circles for you to soak. The tank will have to solo soak a smaller circle towards the front, while the rest of the party will have to stack on Chromie in order to help reduce damage taken. During that time, the healer may want to also heal Chromie if her health gets low at any point. Afterwards, Chromie will give you a 50% haze buff, while Galakron will use Earth Surge to shield himself. You want to try to break the shield as fast as possible while avoiding any rendering Earth spikes. Afterwards, when you break the shield, the boss will cast Pulverizing Exhalation. When dodging this frontal, you want to make sure you move together as one group, either all to the left or all to the right, because after the frontal, some of your group members will spawn pulverizing creations which need to be interrupted and then killed during the encounter. When the boss health reaches 90%, he will cast Cataclysmic Obliteration. During that time, you want to jump under Chromie's Timeline Transcendence and then DPS the boss as hard as possible until you meet the damage check. In part 2 of the Dawn of the Infinite Mega Dungeon, we'll start out with Tyr, the Infinite Keeper. During this encounter, all of Tyr's abilities will consecrate the ground, so just be careful with your positioning on the boss platform. As a group, you want to stack together for the Dividing Strike. The tank is going to have to deal with Titanic Blow, which will try to knock you backwards, so make sure you're not standing on the edge of the boss platform. And the healer is going to want to look out for Sparks of Tyr to dispel from their allies. When the boss casts Siphon Oathstone, he'll begin to draw Temporal Essence towards the center of the boss arena. Every single player in the party will want to soak as many Temporal Essences as possible to give yourself a damage buff, but you also want to make sure the Temporal Essences don't reach the center, otherwise you take AoE damage. The next two bosses can be done in any order, so we'll start out with the Lost Time Battlefield. During this encounter, you'll either be facing Anduin Lothar or Grommash Hellscream. There isn't too much difference between these bosses as they do mostly the same mechanics. As a tank, you want to make sure to have a defensive to brace for the Decapitate ability, which will leave you gravely wounded. And as a group, you want to make sure to dodge the Shockwave frontals. When a boss fixates on a player with Blaze Storm, you'll want to make sure to get away from the boss as soon as possible. And periodically throughout this encounter, the boss is going to call upon 3 allies to help him in combat. You want to make sure that these adds are always your top priority. Interrupt the spellcast and try to control them and take him down as soon as possible. But instead of doing Time Lost Battlefield first, you could always go to Morty instead. During the encounter with Morty, the tank is going to get hit with a Sand Blast Frontal, which the tank will have to aim away from the party. The boss is going to periodically cast More Problems Transition, where the boss will create a bunch of copies of Morty around the boss arena. Every fake Morty is going to be wearing a hat, so look for the real one that isn't wearing anything, and get behind the real Morty to dodge your Dragon's Breath ability. Afterwards, the boss will leave some time traps on the ground, which you'll want to avoid, and then show summon familiar faces, which will be illusions of you as the player that will fixate only on you and will deal heavy personal damage. Certain classes will be able to use crowd control abilities such as Freezing Trap, Blind, or even the Root from Druids in order to deal with these adds much easier. Of course, you could always run these adds into time traps, but whenever a time trap is triggered, it deals heavy group-wide damage. Then we have the final boss of Chronoloord Deos, which is a 2-phase fight. During the first phase, the tank is going to have to aim Temporal Breath away from the party. And your group is also going to have to manage Infinity Orbs to make sure that you don't have 2 orbs dropping at the same time, otherwise your party will wipe to the debuff of Infinity Nova. The best way to deal with this is to assign a ranged or a healer to deal with the mechanic, by having everybody move away from Infinity Orbs except for that one assigned player. Stand under one orb long enough until the Infinity Nova debuff is expired. During phase 1, the boss will summon Infinite Timekeepers, which should be your top priority. Try to eliminate them as fast as possible before they begin to cast Infinite Blast or Chrono Burn, which the healer will need to dispel. Once the boss reaches 20% health, he'll transition into phase 2, where the boss will leave puddles of infinite corruption throughout the encounter. The way to handle this is basically to play it like it's phase 1, dealing with Infinity Orbs and the tank dealing with Temporal Breath, but then you have to move the boss around every time he casts Infinite Corruption. And after defeating the boss, that'll be the end to Dawn of the Infinite Part 2. Next, let's take a look at the dungeons from the expansion of Battle for Azeroth, starting with Waycrest Manor. Waycrest starts out as a very open-ended dungeon. Unlike the way it worked back in BFA, all of the doors are open from the entrance of this dungeon, which allows you to take on the 3 first bosses in any order. One of those bosses could be Ral the Gluttonous, which is a very straightforward fight. Ral is going to summon Bile Oozlings throughout the encounter, which shouldn't be your focus. Try to focus the boss as best as possible. From time to time, the boss will also cast Tenderize, which is a wide frontal that you should try to avoid as best as possible. Periodically, Ral will also call upon 4 servants to slowly walk towards the boss. You want to make sure that these servants never reach the boss, otherwise he casts Gluttonous Bile, which will deal heavy group-wide damage. Either kill the servants or crowd control him as best as possible. Another boss you can take on is the Soulbound Goliath, which has a main mechanic that the tank is going to have to manage of Soul Harvest. Throughout the encounter, the boss gains stacks of Soul Harvest, which means that every time he uses the ability of Crush against the tank, Soul Harvest will buff the damage he does to that tank. But you can also walk the boss into some wildfire to set him ablaze, which will remove the harvest stacks but will deal heavy group-wide damage. Periodically, the boss will also cast Soul Thorns on any one of your party members, besides the tank. These should be your top priority and should be DPS down as soon as possible, though certain classes with shape-shifting abilities, like Shamans with Ghost Wolf or Druids in any of their forms, can actually pre-immune the Soul of Thorns ability, which will make those classes quite lucrative. And the third of these bosses is a Heartsbane Triad, which will have you fight 3 Witch Sisters, Sister Selena, Sister Malady, and Sister Briar. Each sister is going to pick up the Focusing Iris one at a time, and the sister that's holding the Focusing Iris is going to be the most dangerous. This means you need to interrupt that sister's Soul Bolt, Ruinous Bolt, or Bramble Bolt, but only focus on the one holding the Iris. Sister Selena is going to pick up the Iris first. She'll exude Aura of Apathy, which will limit healing for your group, and will cast Soul Manipulation from time to time, which will mind control one of your party members. DPS the ally that's mind controlled to break him out of the effect. When she reaches 50% health, Sister Malady will pick up the Focusing Iris. She'll gain an Aura of Dread, which means that as long as allies are not moving, they'll take additional shadow damage, so try to move constantly. She'll also cast Unstable Runic Mark, which is a curse effect that could be dispelled by certain classes. This curse will deal a set amount of damage to all allies around you, so try to make sure you give each other a bit of space. When Sister Malady drops to 50% health, then Sister Briar picks up the Focusing Iris. With her, you'll get the Aura of Thorns, which will simply deal group-wide damage. She'll also cast Jagged Nettles on a random player, which the healer will want to heal through in order to help the ally escape danger. And after Briar hits 50% health, then Selena will pick up the Iris again, then back to Malady, and then back to Briar. The fourth boss of this encounter is Lord and Lady Waycrest. At first, you'll just be fighting against Lord Waycrest, and as his health gets low, Lady Waycrest will sacrifice her health to heal him back up to full. Lord Waycrest gains more damage the longer that he is up, so you should be your top priority focus. Lord Waycrest is going to assault the tank with Wasting Strike, which does heavy nature damage. He also picks a random player for Virulent Pathogen, which is the disease that could be dispelled. Once dispelled, avoid the Contagious Remnant. And also make sure you're on the move whenever Lady Waycrest casts Discordant Cadenza. Once Lady Waycrest hits 10% health, she'll join the encounter also. During this time, you'll still want to focus on Lord Waycrest because of his stacking damage buff. But Lady Waycrest can be easily interrupted. As long as she doesn't get her cast off, she doesn't really do any damage. Then we have the final boss of Gorak Tul. Throughout the encounter, Gorak Tul is going to call on Death Touch spawns. These spawns need to be killed or interrupted before they cast Death Lens on one of your allies. But these spawns never fully die, as Gorak Tul is going to attempt to resurrect them throughout the encounter. The only way to make sure that these spawns don't come back is by hitting them with the Alchemical Fire, which you'll find located around the boss arena. Outside of this, just interrupt Darkened Lightning from Gorak Tul. Next, we have another BFA dungeon of Adal'Dazar, and similar to Waycrest Manor, the first 3 bosses of Atal can be done in any order, which will allow for some interesting dungeon pathing. The first of these bosses will be Razan. Inside of the boss arena, you'll have purple puddles of bones around the room, and walking over them will spawn additional adds which you'll want to try to avoid. At the start of the encounter, try to position the boss somewhere next to a wall so you can hide away from his terrifying visage, which is an AoE group-wide fear, unless you have classes like a Shaman who can Tremor Totem out of the effect. Afterwards, the boss will fixate on one of the players with a Pursuit, which is incredibly deadly if you do let the boss reach you at any moment while you're fixated, and usually tries to pursue a target that's furthest away from him after he uses Terrifying Visage. Besides this, the tank and the healer will want to be on the lookout for Serrated Teeth ability, which will bleed up the tank, dealing heavy personal damage. The next of these bosses will be Volcal, which has 2 phases. In phase 1, Volcal is immune to all damage as long as reanimation totems are active. You'll want to make sure that all 3 of these totems die within a similar time frame of each other in order to remove his invulnerability. Throughout this encounter, the tank will want to chase after the boss every time he casts Toxic Leap, and then be on the lookout to interrupt Noxious Stench as soon as possible, otherwise you take heavy group-wide damage. And once all 3 totems are broken, the boss will finally become vulnerable. Throughout that time, the boss will start erupting toxic oozes all throughout the boss arena. Try to maneuver the boss throughout the arena to give your allies a little bit of space, while making sure to interrupt them whenever you cast Noxious Stench. The third of these bosses will be Priestess Alunza. Throughout the encounter, the priestess is going to summon blood pools all throughout the boss arena. All players in the group will want to pick up these pools before she casts the ability of Transfusion, where she will try to siphon your health back towards her. But if you pick up one of the bloods on the ground, instead of healing her, you will instead deal damage to her. Throughout the encounter, healers will want to look out for the Molten Gold debuff to dispel from their allies. Tanks will want to pay attention whenever the boss casts Gilded Claws, as that'll give her extra additional damage, though the buff can be spell stolen or dispelled. Lastly, the bosses are going to summon adds from the top of the stairs after every transfusion. These adds are going to waddle towards Anira's blood, and these adds need to be controlled and destroyed before they consume any of the blood on the ground. Finally, we got Yasma, the final boss of this instance. One of the Yasma's main mechanics is going to be Soul Rend. The souls of your DPS and the healer will be rended and start waddling towards the boss. This will deal some personal damage, but then the souls themselves need to be controlled and stopped before they reach the boss, otherwise you will take some group-wide damage. The boss will also periodically cast Racking Pain, which the tank will need to be on top of, and the tank will want to brace with the defensive whenever she uses the ability of Skewer. And throughout the fight, the boss will also summon spiders. At times, these spiders wander around aimlessly, and other times they'll grow bigger and fixate on certain players, marching towards them slowly. Coming into contact with any of these spiders will deal heavy personal damage. So the tank is going to want to maneuver the boss around to make sure that the rest of the group has plenty of space to avoid the spiders. Next, let's take a look at some of the Legion dungeons, starting out with our very first boss of the Archdruid. The Archdruid is going to shapeshift into 2 primary forms for you to deal with. The first will be a Primal Rampage, where he shapeshifts into a bear and charge towards the tank's location. The tank will want to make sure to face the boss away from the party when that happens. Also, the boss will shapeshift into a cat form and leap to one of your allies to leave on him a grievous tear. The healer is going to want to heal that ally until they're above 90% health in order to deal with a bleed effect. Throughout the encounter, the Archdruid will also summon adds, which will fixate on players while leaving puddles on the ground. The DPS players will want to control these adds to limit the amount of space they end up corrupting, while also taking care of the adds as soon as possible. The next boss is Oakheart, which will have a handful of abilities. First of all, the tank is going to have to deal with the Breath Frontal, which they'll want to aim away from the party. Then occasionally the tank will be picked up by the boss and hit with a Crushing Grip for 5 seconds, which will deal very heavy damage. The healer and the tank will be responsible in using defensives and cooldowns to mitigate the damage of this ability. The DPS classes should prioritize hitting the boss and focusing on him as much as possible, while mostly cleaving down the adds, but also making sure that you do not get overrun. Throughout the encounter, the boss will also use a Stomp ability, which will knock everybody back while dealing heavy group-wide damage. Next, we have the Dragon Boss Dalaran. For this boss, there's 3 main mechanics for you to focus on. The first ability will be Breath of Corruption, which will be aimed at a tank, but then the boss will fixate and then breathe in that direction. During that time, the tank is free to position away from the boss to not get hit by Breath of Corruption. The second ability is Downdraft, which will start pushing all of the players away from the boss. These winds, however, are more powerful the further you're away from the boss, so try to stay next to the dragon boss as much as you can throughout this encounter. Another ability to watch out for is Earthshaken Roar, which will deal heavy group-wide damage and will leave a puddle on the ground that you'll want to avoid. And the final boss of the encounter will be the Shade of Xavius. The Shade of Xavius will cast 2 primary abilities, either a Nightmare Bolt, which will make you stand next to allies for Waking Nightmare, or Induce Paranoia, which will make you want to stay away from allies, otherwise you get feared. Tanks are going to want to use a defensive whenever they get hit by Festering Rips, and healers want to watch out for any allies getting hit by Feed on the Weak. And when the boss hits 50% health, he'll cast Apocalyptic Nightmare, which will deal group-wide damage and will start to rain swirlies on the boss arena floor, which will deal damage unless you avoid them. Then we have Black Rook Hold, starting with the Amalgam of Souls, which has 2 phases. During phase 1, you want to avoid a certain set of abilities, such as Soul Reap, which is a frontal 180-degree cleave. Then you have Swirling Scythe, which will focus on a player, and once it reaches that player's location, it will stay in place. Certain members of your group will also get Soul Echoes debuff, which will cause them to leave fragments of their souls behind as they move around, where these soul echoes will erupt after a little bit of time. You want to try to slowly walk around the boss while placing these echoes to make sure that your allies have plenty of room to get out of the way before they erupt. And when the boss reaches 50% health, they transition into phase 2, where they will call 7 restless souls to slowly march towards their location. These souls need to be slowed down, controlled, and killed before they reach the amalgam. The more of these souls the amalgam absorbs, the more damage it will do. And after the boss is done channeling call souls, it'll unleash a soul burst that will deal damage for every restless soul that it absorbs. Afterwards, the boss goes back into phase 1 until the end of the encounter. The next boss is Elisana Ravencrest, which is another 2-phase encounter. During phase 1, try to spread up a little in order to avoid being cleaved by Brutal Glaive, and the tank should have a defensive ready for every time the boss casts Vengeful Shear. Every so often the boss is also going to fixate on a few players with a Dark Rush. Players fixated will want to place themselves away from the center of the boss room. Whenever the boss charges with Dark Rush, she leaves blazing trails on the ground, which will leave you with less space throughout the encounter. Once the boss reaches maximum energy, she begins phase 2, where the boss will fly up into the air and cast I-beams at ranged players. I-beam needs to be kited, and similar to Dark Rush, it'll leave Fellblaze ground trails on the ground as you move with I-beam. So you want to leave as much space for your group as possible by taking I-beams towards the edges of the boss arena. During phase 2, the boss is also going to summon a Soul Torn Vanguard, which needs to be controlled by the tank. You want to make sure that the Soul Guard is faced away from all your allies to avoid his Bone Crushing Strike. The rest of the damage dealers should focus on the Risen Arcanist and interrupt his Arcane Blitz ability. Once the Risen Arcanist is dead, you can go back to prioritizing the boss while cleaving down the Soul Torn Vanguard. After a short period of phase 2, the boss will then resume back to phase 1 until the end of the encounter. The third boss of the instance will be Smash Spite the Hateful, whose main ability will be a Hateful Gaze. He will fixate on a single player and then use a Hateful Charge towards that player, dealing damage to the first target that he runs into. When a player gets hit with a Hateful Charge, they take 500% more damage from the next Hateful Charges for 1 minute, so you'll need to coordinate with your party members to make sure that an ally does not take 2 Hateful Charges in a row. The tank is going to want to be very careful with the ability of Brutal Haymaker, which will leave you vulnerable to all damage taken. And the healer is going to want to watch the rest of your party every time the boss casts Earth-Shaking Stomp. Throughout the encounter, you also have Fellbats fixate on random players, where they will use the ability of Fell Vomit to leave a trail of Fell on the ground. When a bat is fixated on the player, it'll create a green line between the bat and the player, which will let you aim the Fell Vomit away from your allies towards the corner away from the center of the boss arena. Finally, we have the last boss of Lord Ravencrest, which is also another 2-phase fight. During the first phase, you're fighting the Lord Waycrest himself. In phase 1, the tank is going to want to use a defensive for Unnearing Sheer tank ability, while the DPS and the healers will need to dodge the Whirling Blade, which will keep boomeranging between the boss and his throne location. Throughout the encounter, you also want to avoid being hit by the Dark Blast. When Ravencrest reaches 20% health, the fight will change from phase 1 into phase 2, where instead of fighting Ravencrest, you'll be fighting the Dreadlord Dantalianax. In phase 2, the Dreadlord will have a new set of abilities. The first of which is Shadowbolt Volley, which will deal heavy group-wide damage. The next is Stinging Swarm, which will be cast on a random party member to deal heavy damage to them while disrupting all of their actions. The Stinging Swarm needs to be a top priority as soon as it is active. From time to time, the Dreadlord is going to vanish with the Dreadlord's Guile. During that time, you'll want to dodge all of his Dark Obliterations, which will spin around the room either clockwise or counterclockwise, while avoiding any clouds of hypnosis to not get crowd controlled. Then we have the dungeon of Everbloom, starting with the first boss of Witherbark. As you begin this encounter, it is highly recommended for the tank to drag this boss away from any source of water, as creating additional distance away from water gives you a chance to maximize the value of the Brittle Bark debuff. During the first part of the fight, the tank should prioritize keeping the boss faced away from the rest of the party so that your group does not get cleaved by the Parched Gasp ability. Players will also be targeted by vines that will travel towards the player's location. Try to place these vines between the boss and the source of water in order to deal with the next major mechanic. And once the boss's energy depletes down to 0, he gains the debuff of Brittle Bark, which makes him take 100% additional damage. During that time, however, water globules are going to spawn from a nearby source of water and then travel slowly towards the boss. These globules should be slowed down and DPS'd by the rest of your party members. But globules can also be absorbed by the vines left by your party members. These vines will turn into ads that aren't necessarily threatening, but they do a fantastic job at soaking up any of the globules. The best way to approach this encounter is by positioning the boss in such a way where you can avoid the maximum number of globules absorbed, keeping the boss in the brittled bark state for far longer to execute out more damage. The next boss will be Ancient Protectors, which has seen a lot of changes since its initial inception back during Warlords of Draenor. In this encounter, you'll be fighting against 3 bosses, 2 of which will be casters with an interrupt rotation, while the third one will be managed by the tank, who will need to be adjusted positionally so he's always next to another boss to be cleaved. Primarily, your group will be swapping between either Life Warden Gola or the Earthshaper Tellu. When fighting the Earthshaper at the start of the encounter, you want to make sure that the DPS interrupt Toxic Bloom ability. As Nature's Wrath can still go through, you'll just need to manage defensives and healing in order to mitigate its damage. At some point, however, the Earthshaper will start dealing group-wide damage, where you'll want to back away from the Earthshaper in order to reduce its impact. That's when you'll switch over to Life Warden Gola to make sure you interrupt his Revitalize ability. Periodically, the third boss managed by the tank, named Dulu, will use a Noxious Charge ability. Every time he uses a Noxious Charge, you will see Noxious Discharges appear under every player in your group. During that mechanic, you want to make sure that you create some space away from any of the bosses, just to make sure that any of your melee party members can still reach the boss if necessary. Next, we have Archmage Soul, which will use Fire, Frost, and Arcane abilities in order to disrupt and control your party. The Fire ability will be Cinderstorm, which deals heavy group-wide damage while leaving burning puddles on the ground. The Frost ability will be Glacial Infusion, which sends out frozen spheres all around players that eventually collapse inwards. These spheres need to be avoided, otherwise they'll encapsulate the player, stunning them for 4 seconds. Then we have the Arcane ability called Spatial Compression, where the boss will send out an arcane sphere towards a distant player. You want to dodge the sphere to avoid any damage taken, and when the sphere lands, it'll pull all players in your party towards the sphere's impact location. And throughout this encounter, you'll always be dealing with at least 2 of these abilities at once, either a Frost and Fire combination, Arcane and Fire, or Arcane and Frost. And all of these combinations will cause your party to make positional adjustments, whether you're dealing with the Arcane or the Frost buff at any moment. The final boss of this instance will be Yalnu. Yalnu has a handful of mechanics for your party to manage. First of all, tanks will want to make sure to aim the boss away from your party for the main ability of Colossus Blow. Throughout this encounter, the boss will cast Verdant Eruption, which summons a Flourishing Ancient. Once an Ancient is in play, it needs to be killed as soon as possible. Healers may want to plan party-wide healing cooldowns, as while active, the Ancient will pulse will Vibrant Flourish, which will deal large amounts of group-wide damage. Shortly after summoning the Ancient, the boss casts Genesis, which will spawn lashes on the floor of the boss arena. These lashes, however, can be removed early by having any of your party members run over the lashers. You want to try to use all mobility available to your group in order to remove these slashes before you actually have to fight them, so that you can focus on the boss the entire encounter, as the boss does have a ton of health. Finally, we have the Dungeon of Throne of the Tides, which is a Cataclysm instance which has seen quite a lot of changes for Season 3. The first boss of the instance will be Lady Najjar. When fighting this boss, you want to try to interrupt as many water bolts as possible, and stay slightly spread for the focused Tempest channel cast. If you are ever targeted by a shock blast, make sure you get away from your allies so that they have an easier time dodging any of the shocking orbs. The boss is also going to have 2 identical intermissions. One of them will happen when she reaches 60% health, and the other will happen when she reaches 30% health. During the intermission, she's going to summon Nazjatar Frost Witches, an Honor Guard, and a bunch of Deep Sea Murlocs. These sea witches need to either be crowd controlled or interrupted, and you want to make sure to stop all of their casts whenever they get the Icy Veins personal buff. The Honor Guard will periodically use his Trident's Flurry frontal ability, which you'll want to avoid. And if you can, be sure to de-enrage him when he has the Slithering Assault aura. The next boss is Commander Ulthok. During this encounter, the commander will target every player in your party with Bubbling Fissure. Bubbling Fissures will leave pools on the ground, which should be ideally placed as close together as possible. After Bubbling Fissure, the boss will cast Festering Shockwave, which will send all of your party members flying backwards while dealing heavy damage over time. After a festering shockwave, those bubbling fissures will turn into bubbling oozes. Oozes cannot be killed, but they will get knocked back whenever you deal damage to any of the oozes. You want to try to control these oozes as best as possible before they turn back into bubbling fissures. As the encounter goes on, the boss will keep spawning more bubbling fissures throughout the boss arena, which gives you even more bubbling oozes to deal with every single cycle. Lastly, the tank is going to want to watch out for the Crushing Claw ability, which will make him vulnerable to all damage taken for 10 seconds. And after defeating the second boss of this instance, on your way towards the elevator, you'll encounter a brand new gauntlet. In this gauntlet, you'll have these massive behemoths, radiating lightning waves in front of them. Try to take this gauntlet slow because there's no really good checkpoints around it. The third boss of this instance will be Mindbender Gersha, which is a two-phase fight. The first phase will have a versing versus a mind-controlled Stone Speaker. During this phase, you'll want to try to dispel Flame Shock as often as possible, as it does very heavy personal damage. You also want to be fast on your feet when the boss starts to cast Earth Fury. Periodically, the boss is going to spawn a Storm Flurry totem, which is going to greatly increase his damage to your tank. Try to prioritize this totem as soon as possible. When the boss reaches 25% health, it'll begin phase 2, where this time you'll be versing against the Mindbender. And the Mindbender only has a handful of abilities, first of which will be a Terrifying Vision, which you'll want to hide behind a wall in order to line aside the fear effect. And the healer will want to be careful managing the health of your party while the group is dying to the Mind Rot ability. Lastly, we have the final boss of Ozumat, which consists of two phases. The first phase is called Filthy Invaders, where we'll be fighting against the Ink of Ozumat. During this phase, some players will be targeted by a Blotting Barrage. Do not overlap barrages together, instead try to place them as close together as possible away from the boss's central location. Afterwards, two players will be amplified with a Cleansing Flux, which will let you clean up the blotting darkness that is left on the ground. Shortly after Cleansing Flux, the boss will cast Putrid Roar. Every target that didn't have a Cleansing Flux will be hit by a powerful damage over time effect. Shortly afterwards, Ozumat's Ink will summon additional adds into the encounter. Your party members will need to interrupt Splotch's Ink Blast ability while the tank groups up all of the adds around the boss. While the tank positions the boss carefully so he doesn't hit their allies with a Murky Spew ability. And through the entire first phase, you want to manage as much spacing as possible to make sure that you're not getting zoned out by blotting darkness. Once you defeat the Ink of Ozumat, phase 2 will begin, where every player in the party will receive a Tidal Surge buff. At this stage of the fight, you'll be attacking Ozumat directly, while trying to burn him down as fast as possible. As per usual, if you guys enjoyed this video or found it informative, go ahead and give it a thumbs up. I would very much appreciate it. And as always, in the description of every single video and live stream, we have a link to our Discord community channel. Probably the best place to reach out to me directly in case you want to let me know what you thought about this video or hang out with the rest of the community to discuss some of the upcoming changes. Join our Discord to become part of the community. But otherwise, thank you all so much for watching this video. I do hope you guys enjoyed. Let me know all of your thoughts down below. And as always, I'll see all of you guys in another video.